Talking about a subject tonight that probably affects all of us, and I say probably liberally, or conservatively rather, probably affects all of us in one way or another. I could say we're going to be talking about money, and I'd be correct. I could be talking about saving up for tomorrow, and I'd be correct. I could be talking about greed, and I would be more correct in looking at our particular parable this evening from Jesus in the 12th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. I find it interesting that Jesus, in the first 12 verses of Luke chapter 12, is talking about preaching and persecution and things that could happen and how God cares for his people, that, even if you're persecuted, that God knows that the very hairs of your head are all numbered. And do not fear, for you are more valuable than many sparrows. And he goes on and talks about confessing him before men. He's talking about preaching the gospel at that point, and some of the things that might happen to individuals as they went out and preached. And I want you to try and take that point in the context, into consideration, because I, as a teacher, or quite often, and even as a preacher at times, have taught certain topics or subjects. And I'll just hone in on the points that I'm making and try to highlight the subject and really make that sermon or that Bible class live. And then somebody will come up to me afterward or come up in class out of the clear blue with something that has relatively nothing to do with what I'm talking about, which tells me they're really not listening. They're really waiting for an opportunity to talk about whatever's on their mind. I believe that's what we're seeing here as you pick up in verse 13, that Jesus is teaching all this, but there's an individual in the crowd that wanted Jesus' attention, and he said, "Teacher, I've got a problem. I want you to tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." Now tell me what that has to do with what Jesus has been talking about. Nothing. But people are people, and Jesus lets him know, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbitrator over you?" In other words, my purpose on earth is not to settle family disputes over inheritances. That's not why I'm here. And I guess he could say, "Weren't you listening to what I said before?" And I just found that interesting as I studied the text. But Jesus doesn't leave it there. Okay, he addresses the issue. He sees a problem with this individual. And so, in his masterful way, he addresses the problem. And he's not just, I don't know who all is listening. He said to them, maybe his brother's standing there, and maybe this man raised, he's in the crowd, so everybody's listening. So Jesus takes advantage of the opportunity to teach a lesson about greed. Have you ever noticed? I know you have. It's a rhetorical question. Have you ever noticed that when somebody dies that has much of anything, there are vultures, as we might call them, waiting to get their hands on whatever might be theirs. And of course, if a parent has left something to children, naturally there are things, maybe because of the emotional attachment, some of the things they had we like to have, and I'm kind of that way. Maybe too much because I have too much stuff, but there's a difference in wanting granddaddy's watch or grandmother's handkerchief and being greedy. And Jesus perceives greed here. And he said, beware and be on your guard against every form of greed, or as some translations say, covetousness. We probably relate better to the word greed. And hoarding might even fit into this. For not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions. In other words, you may have a lot of things, but that's not what your life is really supposed to be about. Now, granted, we like nicer things. I'd rather sit on a comfortable chair than a chair with springs sticking through it. You know, I would rather have a comfortable bed than a bed I can't sleep in. Or shoes that are reasonably comfortable than shoes that hurt my feet. I mean, and there are certain, we understand that, but life does not consist of the abundance of the things that we possess. Oh, but it's that way with some people. And you visit with them and they talk about all their things, all their stuff. And they show you they're this and they show you they're that. And there's a measure of arrogance at times. And let us as Christians take to heart what Jesus is teaching us here. He said, he told them a parable, according to verse 16, saying, the land of a rich man was very productive. And he began reasoning to himself, what shall I do, since I have no place to store? I want you to notice these personal pronouns. What shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops? Well, naturally, if you are a farmer and you worked for what you have, you want to take care of what you have. I mean, we drive by fields on the way back and forth between here and home, and we see these huge bales of cotton, and there's a barn that a man has that he puts his rolled hay up in, and obviously he uses some of it. He may sell some of it, I don't know, but I mean, we understand the need for storage of the produce. But I want you to notice what Jesus, he's not saying there's anything wrong with having produce and storing things up, but he says, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger barns, and there I will store all my grains and my goods. Now, Jesus is teaching us something here. The emphasis on my things. And I will say to my soul, he's talking to himself, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, drink, and be merry. But God said something to him. You fool. You know, if God calls somebody a fool, we better pay attention to why he's saying that. This very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you've prepared? So is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. So in Jesus' teaching session here, he's interrupted by this individual who probably has not been listening to anything he said, just waiting for an opportunity. Lord, tell my brother to divide our family inheritance. Obviously, the parent or parents have deceased, and they're fighting over the inheritance. And Jesus says, in so many words, that's not my purpose here. I didn't come here to settle your family disputes. And so please don't ask me to do that as a preacher either. You know, but I might do the same thing Jesus did. But you know, I might need to read this for myself and pay attention to what Jesus is saying. But Jesus rebukes the situation and makes it very clear that a man's life really, according to God, does not consist in the things that he possesses or the things that he owns. Have you collected things and misplaced them? Where is my this? Now, there are certain things we have that we need. As far as I'm concerned, a man needs a pocket knife. He needs it in his pocket. I've been carrying one since I was how old? And somebody says, you got a pocket knife? Well, I've got my pants on, I got my pocket knife. And if I lost it, I would replace it. But what about the things that we have that we don't really need? Because I use my knife, but there's some things I have I don't have to have. They just are enjoyment to me. And some of them are in cases or in boxes or under a bed or in a closet, and we get so wrapped up in these things. Now this man has had a plentiful crop. You might call it a bumper crop. And he didn't know where he was going to put all of his stuff. And obviously he was wealthy, he was an able and wise farmer. He had a legitimate job, a legitimate career, and he seems to have had the wisdom to garner his crops. But he had what we might refer to as a bumper crop. Now Jesus is implying something when he gets down to the end of it. Is there anything wrong with storing up the things that you've worked for? Well, no. But Jesus says, but there's a problem here. Number one, you're going to die tonight. Then what? Whose will these things be? You're not going to take any of it with you. But while you're here, you really need to, it's all right to have these things, but you also need to be rich toward God. And so why not build some barns for the purpose, if you have more than you need, and we need mirrors probably, some of us, don't we? How about sharing some of it with somebody less fortunate? Maybe they're not as good a farmer as you are. Maybe they have fallen on hard times, legitimately so, through sickness, or, there are people right now who are really hurting because of COVID. I am so thankful to God every day that COVID has not affected my paycheck or my job, but it has some people. It has put some people in dire straits. And I know that God promises to take care of his people, but even so, sometimes even Christians struggle. And so there are people who have needs. But the problem with this man was not what he had, but he wanted it all for himself. It's greed. It's selfishness. It's self-serving. It's like the rich young ruler Jesus talked to. That, son, you just need to sell what you have and give to the poor. Jesus wasn't telling that young man to become destitute. He was trying to get him to change his focus. That you're not the only person in the world, young man. You've done well for whatever reason, and you need to help some people who are less fortunate than you are. Well, you know how it turns out. He couldn't do it, and he went away sorrowfully because he was very rich. And the implication is his riches kept him from being concerned about others. That's what you have here. And so he what if he had stored enough produce for himself? Would that have been okay? Well, sure. What about storing the extra? One of the things that God taught the children of Israel when they planted their fields, to leave the corners of the fields for the poor people. This man was probably Jewish. You'd think he might have known about that principle. Well, obviously he did and forgot about it or ignored it. But there's a way when sometimes think, but I just might need that. And if I give it away, what if I run out? What does Jesus teach in verses 22 through the end of the chapter about worrying about food, clothing, and shelter? And what about those things that he taught there about considering the lilies, how they grow and they neither toil nor spin? But I tell you that even Solomon in all his glory did not clothe himself like one of these. If God, verse 28, so clothes the grass in the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the furnace, how much more, how much more, how much more will he clothe you, O you men of little faith? Faith in who? God. Faith in God's promises to take care of us. And so we come back to this man, and I think he's all focused on himself. And here's the problem. So you have many goods laid up for many years. Take the Epicurean philosophy. Take it easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. He left out a very part of the Epicurean philosophy, though. For tomorrow you die. He didn't think about that, but God reminded him. There are two problems here. One, he didn't care about the needs of others, and the second one was he didn't think about death. You know, you're only one heartbeat away from death. You know that heart attacks are the number one killer. It's not drunk drivers, it's not driving and texting, it's heart attacks. And they can come upon us. I mean, I could fall dead before this lesson was over. The doctor says I'm healthy. Several years ago, when I was a young man, we were in a congregation, and we met on Sunday morning, and they said, call the brother by name, and if I thought about it, I could come up with it. Said, well, brother so-and-so died yesterday. How? He died from a heart attack. He'd just been to the doctor on Friday. The doctor said he was fine. And I don't think he was all that old. And it kind of woke people up to the reality that your soul can be required of you tonight. And I think about it. What if my soul were required of me tonight? What is my disposition toward what God has blessed me with? What is my disposition toward people who are less fortunate than I am? Just because it's in my pocket or in my bank account or wherever does not necessarily mean that it's mine and mine alone. You see, greed is a very, very powerful and tempting sin. And it boils down to, well, what if I don't have enough? And Jesus makes it clear in the latter part of the chapter. Don't you trust God to take care of you? That's really the question that he's putting out there. And so, but he had goods. He said, I have goods not for next year, but for many years. Now, I don't know what kind of crop he had that's going to last for many years. But in his mind, that's what he had. But the problem was he didn't have many years. Matter of fact, he didn't even have the next day, according to God. And so so the popular Epicurean philosophy was, and this comes from 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 32, eat, drink, be merry, for tomorrow we die. What does that mean? I was watching an episode of Sanford and Son recently, and some of those I just don't care for, but somebody was trying to get Fred to get himself a new TV. He said, you need to enjoy life, and you're not going to be here forever. You need to enjoy it. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of people think about, and that alone. They don't think about tomorrow or what's going to happen in death. And the point of the Epicurean philosophy was, well, you need to have a good time because you're not going to be here forever. And not to think about eternity. But you see, this fool that God called him, he left that last part out. He had no funeral plans. Let me tell you something. Everybody has a funeral plan. Unless the Lord comes back and you're transformed without dying. But for the most part, everybody has a funeral plan. You don't know what it is, but there is one. For all of us. But where men propose, God may dispose. Man may plan, but God may say that's not going to work that way. You're not going to be here tomorrow. And God said, you are a fool. Wow. He didn't say that's a bad idea. He said you're a fool. You know, the atheist is called a fool in Psalm 14:1. So this man's classified with an atheist. He's a fool. Why? Because he's not concerned about anybody else, and he's not thinking about what's going to happen to you when you die. Do you know why the rich man in Luke 16 lost his soul? Not because he had money. This man's not in, his soul's not in jeopardy because he has money. His soul is in jeopardy because money has him, and he doesn't care about anybody else. I think, Lord, help me not to have that disposition with my possessions. Let me be generous within reason, but try to help people who are legitimately in need. But God called him a fool. You know, the margin of the New American Standard Bible says, "You fool, this night they are demanding your soul from you." There's a similar marginal expression in the Old American Standard Version. What's the implication? Your possessions are demanding your soul. Now, possessions are inanimate objects. But if that's a correct rendering, then he thought only of himself, and his possessions, it could be an idiomatic expression demanding more than your soul is required of you. Your possessions are taking your soul away from you. But he let them do it. If the devil is in my life or yours, we let him in. James tells us to resist him and he will flee, but what if you don't resist him? He'll take up residence. He'll sit down in your chair. He'll control your bank account. He'll control everything you have if you let him take control. And so possessions can control us. And I think, oh, don't let them do that to me. And so the Lord says now, when you die, whose will those things be? What are you applying, Lord? You're not taking any of it with you. And there's an old saying that shrouds have no pockets. Why? They don't need a pocket. I've been to several funerals, and we buried a child in 1996 that was 4.5 months in the womb, and we put toys in the coffin. But those toys were for us. You know, the Indians would bury their dead with possessions. What about King Tutankhamun? All those possessions they found in his tomb. How much good did they do him? He's still as dead as he can be. He's nothing but dirt. When I die, we won't take anything with us. You can put it in the coffin if you want to. They could put it in our body and sew it up. You're still not taking it with you. So whatever we have it here, and Jesus is implying that our possessions can possess us and cost us our souls. And I think that's a sobering thought, isn't it? And it raises the question, has God blessed you? Has God blessed me? And I'd say, looking at this room, that I know that God has blessed some of us with more than others. There's never a total equality. But even the least blessed person can at times share with somebody who's less well off than they are. And I think, what's my disposition toward the needy? But that's mine. I worked for it. Well, maybe you did. Who gave you your body? Who gave you your mind? Who gave you the skill of the right hand? Who gave you your ability to do or think this way or that way? Who put you in the position you are in? Oftentimes we say we did. But then when you get in bad shape, it's God's fault. Wait a minute. God gives us our bodies. He made us. And He gave us some more ability to make and think and be more successful in life in some ways than others. But I tell you what, He gives everybody the ability to care. And that's what I want to get out of this lesson. Because in the psalmist said the earth and all its fullness is the Lord's. All of its fullness? You mean whatever's in my bank account is God's? Elise and I went down a muddy road the other day to visit Sister Hay. I said, "You're going to get mud on your car." And she said, "This is not my car, it's God's." And I didn't say another word. Well, she was right. It is God's car. My truck is God's truck. My money is God's money. If you get right down to it, because He owns everything. He owns the earth and all of its fullness. And so I think about it. So is the man then who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Did you notice the phraseology that our Lord used? I was showing this morning Brother Steve Jones this check that's in my Bible, and I carry it, and I'm probably going to laminate it. My granddaddy Leonard did not grow up in the church, but he knew how to make money. He had a good mind to start a business that lasted in our family from 1931 to 1984, and it fed us well. We worked hard, but it fed us well. And Granddaddy became a Christian in his 70s. I'm not sure exactly what year. I'm saying something somewhere around 69. He was born in 1892, so you figure it out. But when he became a Christian, it changed him. It changed him. And he was a member of the Signal Hills Church of Christ in Chattanooga with my grandmother. And they were getting ready to move and build a new building. And I have this check that I found among some of his things from November 17th, 1974. $1,000 for the new location fund. Signed H. Clay Leonard. Now, Granddaddy had money, but he didn't have him. He was generous. And I dare say if we could dig into more, we'd probably find more pieces of generosity like that. And I carry that, and I told Brother Steve this morning, I carry that to remind myself not to be stingy. Because really that $1,000 wasn't his anyway. When we buried him in 1978, he didn't take any of it with him. It was all left to his estate, just like ours will be. But you know, the Bible says, I believe it's Ecclesiastes 5, about verse 10, he who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver. He'll want more. New American Standard says he who loves money will not be satisfied with it. In other words, and you go read Ecclesiastes, and Solomon knew what he was talking about. You read the beginning of Ecclesiastes, and how he sought all these things to make himself happy. And in the end, he said, it was just so wonderful, I just wanted more. And no, he didn't. He said, it's all vanity. Solomon found out that the pleasures of life, even extravagances, really did not make him happy. What's the conclusion of the whole matter when he finishes Ecclesiastes? Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man, or this is man's all. Why? Because God will bring every work into judgment with every secret or every hidden thing. Wow. So God's going to bring into judgment what we have done. And the rich man in Luke 16 was brought into judgment when he died. Not because he was rich, but because he let a starving man go without the crumbs from his table, who was brought to his gate every day. If he'd had a compassionate heart, said, take that man some food out there. If you see any more poor people out there, take them some food. Don't let those people go hungry. If he was a Jew and Lazarus was a Jew, in all likelihood, if they were real people, that's the way it was. The law of Moses taught them to care about the poor among their own people. That man didn't lose his soul because he was wealthy, but because his wealth had him. And so Jesus tells us about our possessions, and he tells us in verse 22, he said to his disciples, see, he's finished the parable now, and he says, for this reason I say to you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, nor for your body as to what you will put on. For life is more than food, and the body is more than clothing. When you read do not worry, that is a present imperative. What does that mean? It's a command that you keep on obeying. Jesus, and this is the hard part, Jesus commands you and me not to worry. It's not just a good idea not to worry. The Lord commands us not to do it. Do you know what it tests? It tests our faith in a God who promises us, look at the lilies of the field. Look at the birds. They don't work, but your heavenly Father feeds them. Will he not much more feed you? See, that rich man would have been taken care of just fine if he said, okay, work for it. I'm going to put up what I need, but I'm going to help some folks with what I have. I'm convinced that the Lord's church could do far more if we would give much more. One of the reasons churches cannot do the Lord's work at times is because the money's not in the bank account to do it. Well, who puts it there? We do. Who put it in our pockets? Careful. God did. So the money that's in our pockets is His. The money that goes into the treasury is His, and how we use it is His business. And I think of some lessons then to be learned here. Covetousness or greed is a very dangerous sin. Things are necessary, but they do not make a life. One can be wise in material things, but also be very foolish in spiritual matters. That man didn't think about his soul. We should look beyond ourselves and look to others and do good. Look for opportunities to do good. You know, the Bible teaches us that if any will not work, in 2 Thessalonians, neither let him eat. God does not expect us to help the lazy, people who won't be responsible. But He does expect us to try to help, especially our brethren, Galatians 6:10, to do good to all men, especially those who are the household of faith. There are some people who could use a little bit, and if they take advantage of my $5, I'm not going to miss it. But in all honesty, when I talk to people, say, look, I'm not giving this money to you for drinking or for drugs. If you say you're hungry, usually I'll just take them somewhere and try to buy them something. But what about people who really have a need? What do? I do what my heart dictates, one way or the other. Let us be thankful for what God has given us. Let us be generous. And this has nothing to do with the sermon, for the collection next Sunday, but it certainly fits. I was listening to Brother Steve before I got up here tonight, and he was talking about a situation where a family had put a sign on the door for October 31st last night, not to knock on the door, and we don't have any candy because we have a child with cancer. And I thought, that's kind of sad, it made me tear up a little bit. But then he said, but by the end of the night, there was candy piled all over the front porch of that house from other kids who read the sign and wanted to be generous. And I thought, there you go. Learn it from the children. Learn it from a child. Could that kid need all that candy? No, but I guarantee you they weren't unhappy to get it. But think about it. Are we that kind of spirit ourselves as adults? Are you subject tonight to the Lord's invitation in one way or another? Is there something we could pray with you about or pray for you about? We always have these opportunities to respond to the Lord's invitation. Life is short. Tomorrow's not promised. Tomorrow's not promised, but Judgment Day is coming. Should it come tonight for you, would you be ready? And if not, please make things right with God in whatever way you need to. And if it needs to be public, please do so as we stand and as Steve leads us.